this goes badly.
Not do it again. That was Lee J, my sibling, over there, and I'm totally including this in the end of the video. We're recording.
No, you're not recording. You're not using my voice in your video.
If you think the quality of my videos has been going downhill so far, you haven't seen anything yet. I feel like I haven't been coming off as super authentic in my videos recently, at least some of the time. Like, I don't know, I'm too smiley. My smile feels fake, and I don't like it. I don't like the way my face looks when I look back at my videos. So, I'm gonna try something new. I'm going to record this video without a script. I have no idea what I'm going to say in the video as of this particular second. I am going to edit it to try to make it make a little bit of sense, and to try to make sure that there's not too much time where I'm just sitting here thinking about what I want to say. But yeah, Hank Green made a video a little while back called The Parable of the Perfect Pot or something like that, where he talks about this Tumblr post, and I also saw that Tumblr post, and I am glad that this is becoming more of a thing in our culture. Basically, the idea of this story about pots is that there were two groups of kids, and one of them made lots and lots and lots of pots, and the other made one pot, and they tried to put as much care as possible into it. And, like, the first group didn't care at all about the quality. They just tried to make as many pots as possible. And all of the best pots were in the group of kids who were just making as many pots as possible. So I'm trying to be in the first group. I'm trying to just make lots of videos. That is not to say we are entering the phase of Zidnaf the daily vlogger. Like, lots and lots of pots, for me, is probably like one a month or something. But I wouldn't be making this video if I didn't feel like I had something interesting and worthwhile to share with you guys. And what I would like to share with you guys is a thing called the World Happiness Report. It's this thing that the UN puts together that I just recently learned about. This report measures a whole bunch of things, but obviously one of the big things it measures is how happy people are in different countries. And there's a lot of different ways you could measure that, but the way this report measures it is they call it the Kam Trail Ladder, and it goes like this. Please imagine a ladder with steps numbered from 0 at the bottom to 10 at the top. Suppose we say that the top of the ladder represents the best possible life for you, and the bottom of the ladder represents the worst possible life for you. If the top step is 10 and the bottom step is 0, on which step of the ladder do you feel you personally stand at the present time? They ask this to a whole bunch of people in as many countries around the world as they possibly can, and the results are really interesting. One of the most interesting things about this is that once you have like this measure of how happy people are, you can compare it to lots of other statistics like GDP and life expectancy and stuff, and you can try to figure out like what makes people happy, what contributes to this and what doesn't contribute so much. Now, if I were you, one of the first questions I would be asking right now is, does it even vary between countries at all when you look at it? Like, maybe there are like very slight variations from country to country, and maybe you could make a big deal out of those slight variations, but like maybe almost everybody in every country just looks at that question and goes, I don't know, like a 5. And for sure, there definitely is a huge spike at 5. Like, that spike at 5 is there in every country, in every region. It's kind of amazing. But at the same time, it's super different in different regions. Like, in Western Europe, you're gonna see what I'm looking at on my computer because this is a little bit awkward. In Western Europe, almost everybody says something above a 5, whereas in Sub-Saharan Africa, there's a decent number of people above a 5, but most people say something below a 5. And oh man, in the Middle East and North Africa, there's this uncomfortable spike at 0. Like, I don't know, like around 1% of people in the Middle East, when asked, imagine this ladder, say, I am at a 0. And that, I hope soon enough we get to a day when there are next to no people who say 0 when presented with this question, because 1% is too high. So, the results are definitely different in different countries, but another thing that you could say about this whole thing is you could say...
Are you going to edit the parts where you pause in the middle of a sentence?
Yes.
Yeah, because that's the most boring part of having a conversation with you.
Thanks! Alright, so it's definitely noticeably, measurably different in different countries, but another thing that you could potentially ask is like, is this metric actually a measure of how happy people are? Like, maybe in some cultures in the world, there's like an emphasis on, I don't know, humility and not complaining too much, and maybe in a culture that values people not complaining too much, people would naturally rate their lives as higher, whereas maybe in a culture where people, I don't know, complain all the time, or in a culture where, I don't know, people being honest with their suffering, maybe in those places people would naturally tend to rate their lives as lower. And actually, you do see a fair amount of that. Like, people in East Asia tend to rate their lives as lower, and people in Latin America tend to rate their lives as higher for no apparent reason. That seems to just kind of be this weird cultural thing. But the people who make this report go to a lot of trouble to figure out, can we predict how people will rate their lives on this ladder scale based on other things, based on more objective things? Like, can we build a model that will that will correctly predict how happy people will say they are with their lives based on more objective measures of how a country is doing? And that model turns out to actually work pretty well. They say that it's 75% accurate. I'm not exactly sure how the math works, where you figure out what percent accurate a model is, but I don't know, that sounds high to me. What they do and don't put into this model and how much they weight certain things in order to get it to be as accurate as possible is super interesting. Like, they weight GDP really heavily. Like, how rich a country is just a huge predictor. Like, here's a graph I made of how rich a country is versus how people in that country rate themselves based on happiness. And as you can see, there's a really close correlation. There's a fair amount of variance within that. Richness doesn't guarantee happiness, but it's a huge part of it. But the other really big thing in their model, there's a whole bunch of stuff they put into the model, but the other big one, besides GDP, is this one question they ask people. That question is, if you were in trouble, do you have relatives or friends you can count on to help you whenever you need them, or not? Yeah, they call that social support. And people just give a yes or a no, and they count a no as a 0 and a yes as a 1, and they take the average of all of that, and they give each country a number between 0 and 1 based on how many people answer yes to that question. And like, that correlates a little bit with GDP. Like, people seem to, I don't know why that would correlate with GDP, but it seems to correlate with GDP a little bit. And like, I have no idea what the effects of that on public policy are. Like, is there a way we can design our society such that people have more friends and tighter family connections? I have no idea. But, like, apparently this is a really big deal. I'm going to talk about how democracy plays into all of this, but first, I want to share a bunch of interesting stuff from this report with you, just because I find it fascinating. They make this model, right? They try to predict how happy people are going to report that they are, and then they compare that to how happy they actually are. And some countries are a lot higher than you would expect based on what the model says they should be, and a lot of countries are a lot lower based than what you would expect. And it's really interesting looking for them. Most countries are pretty close to the model, which I guess is what they mean when they say that our model is pretty accurate. But Somalia is weirdly happy. Like, Somalia is absolutely dirt poor. Their social support metric is, it's okay, but it's on the low side. Like, their life expectancy isn't great. Like, none of their metrics that go into this model are great. And yet, the average response from Somalia is a 5. The average person in Somalia, when you ask them, rate your life on this ladder from 0 to 10, it goes, I don't know, like a 5. I don't know, I find that fascinating. And then all of the countries that are weirdly sadder than you would expect, given the model, all of them are Chinese countries. I feel like this is something weirdly cultural. Like, Singapore, Hong Kong is somewhere in here, and I remember Hong Kong also had a weirdly low happiness rating, given what you would expect from the model. One of the things the guys who did this model did is they ran through a hypothetical country that they called dystopia, where everything is as bad as it could possibly be, where it has like a GDP of 0 and nobody has any friends or family and everybody dies as an infant. Like, they just bottom out all of I'm probably misrepresenting exactly how they do this, but one way or another, they bottom out all of these predictors for happiness that they do, and then they run it through the model. And the model says that in dystopia, the average rating on this 0 to 10 life scale would be a 2.1, which seems high to me, but basically what it means is that when you're predicting how happy each of these countries should be, everybody basically gets a free 2.1 on the scale. One of the things you realize when you look at this report is that one country really stands out as being like, in theory, it should be the absolute worst place to live. When you actually ask people there, it turns out to actually be comparable to other countries. Like, this country is actually only the second most unhappy country in the world. The most unhappy country is Burundi. People in Burundi are sadder than they should be, and that pushes them over the edge, and it makes them the number one saddest country in the world. But people in the Central African Republic, the model says that they should be the saddest country in the world, and by a lot. The model says that they should be the saddest country in the world by about a half a rung on the ladder, by like half a point. Like, they are just absolutely dirt poor. They have, like, almost nobody in that country says that they have family and friends they could fall back on. Like, they're like, for some reason, there's, like, no social connections in that country, on top of them being absolutely dirt poor. And, like, life expectancy is abysmal. All the other metrics are pretty abysmal. Like, dystopia should be a 2.1. The Central African Republic should be about a 2.7. Like, that's how crappy Central African Republic is. When you actually measure it, they're about a 3.1. By far, though, the country that is the most unhappy, given what you would expect, I already told you that places like Singapore and Hong Kong are unusually unhappy, given what you would expect, given how wealthy they are and stuff. But Botswana is about 2 points lower on the rung than it should be. That is like the most divergence that you find between what the model says people should be and what they actually say they are. Like, people in Botswana are about a 3.5 on this 0 to 10 how happy are you with your life scale, when the model says that they should be about a 5.5. So yeah, I really want to learn more about both Botswana and the Central African Republic now. Like, why? Why is Botswana so unhappy? Like, it's not a great country. Like, the model says it should only be about a 5. Like, it's not amazing. But why are the people there so depressed? Are there other things going on in that country that the model doesn't account for that's making everyone sad? And Central African Republic, what happened? Who did this to you? Is this the French? They colonized you. Did they do this to you? What happened to make this? What? I know nothing about the Central African Republic. I looked it up on Wikipedia. They've had a lot of wars. They had some ethnic cleansing. I don't know. Did that do it? But that was a few years back. I don't know. How quickly does a country get over genocide? This got dark really fast. This video was a bad idea. I'm being snarky about genocide. This was a bad idea. This trash can, last time my recycling bin was in the background, a lot of people complained about it, and you know what? The more I look at myself in the camera here, the more this bothers me. I'm gonna move out of the way. I'm wearing shorts. I said this video was gonna be bad.
So are you gonna be more upset if this video turns out better than your other ones?
If this video turns out better than my other ones, I'm going to be ecstatic, because that would mean that I don't need to put in any effort into any of my videos ever again. I would be so happy with that. I have no idea how this video is going to turn out, but I figured it was worth an experiment. I've seen other people do videos like this where they just talk at the camera and edit it later and kind of come up with what they're saying on the fly, and I figured I'd try it, and maybe if it goes well, I'd do it again, and maybe I'd get better at it over time. I don't know, we'll see. That was a really long tangent in the middle of the video about the video itself. Let's get back to happiness and democracy. One of the things that the people who made this report didn't take into account in their model was how democratic a country is. And so I decided to do that myself, to try to see if there's any correlation between how democratic a country is and how happy they are. There's a few things out there that try to measure how democratic a country is. There's also things that measure like how free a country is, and also freedom of press and lots of stuff. My favorite of all of these is the Democracy Index, just because it's one of the first I found, and I'm used to it. I don't entirely understand how the methodology of the Democracy Index works, but they try to take into account a whole bunch of stuff. Like, they don't just measure, are elections free and fair? Like, can people run for office if they want? Can they vote for whoever they want? They also try to measure, like, is there a culture of political participation? Like, do people in practice actually go out and vote? They also try to measure, like, civil liberties. Do people have the ability to free speech? Do people have the right to speak for and against candidates if they want? Functioning of government. They try to measure, do governments actually have mechanisms where the people who are elected can then go and implement what the people elected them for? Like, does the government function? Can it change the laws if people demand a change in laws? So here's a graph I made that plots the democracy index against the average response on the life ladder metric. So the y-axis is happiness and the x-axis is democraticness. And there, you can see this big cluster at the top right, and like maybe there's kind of a correlation here, like, but I don't know. Like there's a lot of kind of happy dictatorships, and there's like a lot of very sad countries that are mostly democracies. I don't know. There's kind of a correlation, but like it's not nearly as strong a correlation as GDP versus the score on the life ladder. Like that is very clearly a line. It's a very thick line, but it's a line. All right, so the next thing I did was I made this graph. I made the democraticness, the x-axis, and GDP, or the logarithm of the GDP, because... Okay, so the log of GDP is actually a much more useful metric than actual GDP. And in particular, it's GDP per capita purchasing power parity. I said that in the wrong order, but basically it's trying to like get a feel for how rich a country actually is, and we use a logarithm because it's basically like if all you have is $50 and someone gives you another $10, then that's a lot of money for you. But if you have $1 million and someone gives you another $10, you might not even bother to pick it up. So like $10, an extra $10 is a huge amount if you don't have much money, but it's not very much at all if you have a massive amount of money. So when you're trying to measure how rich people are, a lot of the time a better question to ask than how much money do they have is how many digits does the number of how much money they have in it? And then you just graph that. So you can see like people who have money in the hundreds of dollars, people who have money in the thousands of dollars, and people who have money in the tens of thousands of dollars. What stood out to me is you got a whole bunch of countries in the top right corner and not very much in the bottom right or top left, which I found really interesting. It basically means that like if you're really rich, you're almost definitely going to be a democracy, and if you're really democratic, like if you're a real legit democracy, then you're definitely really rich. Like there's literally no countries in the bottom right, third, ninth of this graph. But what I also found equally interesting is that there isn't really a clear line on this graph. Like if you're not a really rich, really democratic country, then you could be a middle-class dictatorship or a middle-class kind of democracy, or a really poor kind of democracy, or a really poor dictatorship. And there isn't really much of a correlation between any of those. Like you could be in any of those four quadrants. So the next thing I did was I colored the graph based on the responses to the life ladder question. I colored the graph to try to see where on this graph are the happy countries and where on this graph are the sad countries. And the results were fascinating and disconcerting. What you see is basically all of the really happy countries are in that top right ninth, but there's this really clear trend where you get happier the richer you get, but not so much with more democracy. Like it seems like if you're really poor, you're going to be really unhappy regardless of whether you're a dictatorship or a kind of sort of democracy. And if you're really rich, you're probably pretty happy, even if you're a dictatorship. I did notice, though, if you zoom in on that top right ninth, it seems like that trend is kind of reversed. Like, it seems like most of the countries that are really democratic and also really rich are roughly the same level of wealth. There's not a lot of variance up and down here, so they're roughly the same amount of rich. But they are pretty different levels of democraticness. They're all really democratic, but it really looks like the ones that are the most democratic, the ones that have lots of free speech and lots of participation in government and a very well-functioning government, and where the elections are like the most free and fair, those countries really do the happiest, whereas the countries who are still definitely democratic, but kind of struggling still. Those countries, they're still happy, but not nearly as happy as the other ones. They're like a rung or two less democratic. To give some concrete examples. All right, so Portugal is here on the graph. It has a life ladder score of 5.4, and its democracy is kind of struggling, where, like, okay, it's not really struggling, it's very much a democracy. But Portugal is roughly as rich as New Zealand, but the main thing that differentiates them is how good their democracies are. New Zealand is a lot more democratic, and it looks like it's a lot happier as a result, or I don't know, maybe happier people make for better democracies? I think the causation is better democracies leads to happier people, but I don't know, maybe the causation is going the other direction. So I find all of this just fascinating in its own right, but I also don't really know what to take from it. Like, more democratic countries aren't necessarily any happier, apparently. That's not exactly something that lines up with my worldview very well. I rather like democracy. I'm struggling with what to take from this, because, like, part of me looks at this and is like, maybe this should have foreign policy implications. Maybe the United States, when it tries to decide who to support and who not to support, and, like, how to pressure foreign governments, maybe we shouldn't push for democracy all that hard if we want to try to make the world a better place. Maybe we should just try to help countries grow their economies, help them build up infrastructure, try to make them less poor, and not focus so much on the structure of their government. On the other hand, part of me thinks that maybe that's really dangerous. Like, in particular, maybe there are huge flaws in this whole system of measuring happiness based on surveying people and asking them to rate their lives on this ladder. Like, maybe, for instance, if a government just kills a tenth of the population and then distributes the wealth from that tenth of the population to everybody who's still alive, I'll bet the happiness index thing is going to go up, especially if, like, that tenth of the population was a segment of the population that people didn't like too much in the first place. So, like, I wonder if they were able to get prisoners to answer this question. I wonder what prison conditions are like in different countries, and on the other hand, part of me wonders maybe prison conditions aren't that correlated with democracy in particular. Like, God knows, things aren't that great in the US on that front. Now, obviously, I'm going about this from a very particular standpoint. Like, I think that we should try to make people happier in the world. I feel like we should try to improve people's lives, like, on their own terms. Like, figure out what do people want, what do people value, and how are they doing on that sort of self-reported scale, and how can we best serve that? I feel like that's kind of a good way to go about it. But another way that you could also go about it is you could go about it in terms of human rights. You could look at it from the perspective of what rights do people have in this country and what rights don't they have, and then judge them based on that and try to figure out, like, what rights are people entitled to. And you could make a good argument that people are kind of entitled to democracy as a fundamental right, that people should get a say in what their government is doing, like, whether or not that really affects them on a day-to-day basis. I don't really like thinking in those terms, though. Like, I can kind of see how they have some appeal, but I don't really like thinking of things in terms of rights. Like a lot of things that I start thinking about too hard, this is starting to devolve into a conversation about meta-ethics, but let's try to cut it off there. Point is, I don't necessarily agree that people necessarily have a right to get a say in their government. I try to think about things more in terms of what do the people in a place want, what do they value, and what can I and my country do to help get them that. I'm also obviously coming at this from the point of view that the US should play an active role in foreign policy and shouldn't just keep to itself, and that we have an immense amount of power, and that with that comes something of a responsibility to try to help make the world a better place. And when it's appropriate for us to stick our nose into the business of other countries is complicated, and God knows we haven't done a very good job of it. What is the point? The point is, I am coming at this from a lot of very particular philosophical points of view that I have, and those points of view are very much impacting how I am interpreting these results. So I am curious, if you don't share those basic assumptions with me, then what do you think about all these results? Does it surprise you that how democratic a country is, at least for the relatively middle or low income countries, and at least the moderate democracy to dictatorship countries, at least for these countries, democracy doesn't seem to impact happiness all that much. Does that surprise you? Does that have any implications for your worldview? Does it affect your view of democracy? Does it affect your view of how the U.S. should behave itself in the international world? And I also am curious about that if you do agree with me. Is there something I'm not thinking of? Clearly, how wealthy a country is and how tight the social bonds are in that country and how democratic it is and how happy the people are in that country. Clearly, all of these things are interacting with each other and affecting each other in ways that I do not entirely understand, and I don't know what direction cause and effect is going where, and this is kind of a shit video. I stopped the recording and then decided that I didn't want to end the video on a negative note that way. So, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about this video, though. I haven't edited it yet. I don't know how it's going to come together. I didn't get the lighting out. I usually get a lamp out, so there's better lighting. I usually turn off the heating, and I unplug my refrigerator. The refrigerator's been running in the background. I don't know if you can hear it. Tell me in the comments if you can hear the refrigerator. This is very different from any video that I've done before. Do you hate it? Do you love it? Because if you like this video, I could probably do so many of them. This video is so low effort, I could probably I had the idea for this video, yesterday. This video took less than 24 hours to put out. So if you like this video, I could make a lot more of them, probably.